A lot of the guides I know are on the water probably 250 to 300 days a year. They know their fisheries. They know trout. They know what it takes to succeed. Now, Dallas from Utah asked this question because he enjoys finding good spots and learning what the fish are eating on his own. And he wonders if he'd feel like he'd be spoon fed almost if he went with a guide. One of the comments we got on that poll that I want to share is, quote, "You get what you put in. They're a wealth of info. And if you ask questions, they give you their expertise." That's not to say bad guides don't exist. They certainly do. I've had a couple. On today's show, I'll lay out the value of booking a guided trip, as well as some tips to help you get the most out of your investment. This is Untangled, Fly Fishing for Everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant, back at it for another week. They're letting me back on the airwaves for some reason. I don't know why, but I'm glad to be here, just like I am every time I get behind this microphone. I've had some good fishing lately, so I hope that if you've been able to get out after that deep freeze that, put all of the whole nation in a freezer, hope you've been able to get out and have some good fishing lately. I've had some good fishing myself. It's been very cleansing. I certainly needed it. This week's topic was inspired, as they almost always are, by a question from one of our listeners. Dallas in Utah wrote in, and he said, "Hey, Spencer, love the podcast and the YouTube channel. I'm a self-taught fly angler and have learned so much from you and Alex. The bulk of my fly fishing has been done on small streams and lakes in central Utah where I live. I'm planning a trip to the Green River in April to really put my skills to the test. My question is, do you think it is worth it for me to hire a guide? I'm planning on wading and not floating the river, and I feel that part of the fun is finding the holes and figuring out what flies the fish are eating on my own. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks, man." Well, first off, Dallas, thank you for listening to the show. I appreciate it. Alex and I love to hear that kind of feedback. So it makes us feel like we're not just shouting into the void, which it can feel like sometimes. But we really, really appreciate that feedback. Now, I want to take your question, and I'm going to answer your question specifically, Dallas, but more broadly speaking, I wanted to use this as an opportunity to dive into the topic of whether it is worth it. I'm doing air quotes if you're listening to the show and not watching us on YouTube. Whether it's worth it to hire a fly fishing guide. Now, I used to guide, so I do have an opinion on this topic, but I am going to quote some stories from other folks who don't necessarily have a dog in the fight. What I mean by that is I don't want this to, I'm not trying to sell you on a guided trip because I used to be a guide and I think all guides are great or anything like that. And this is something that I try to do in general here at Untangled, where I do have my own opinions, my own way of doing things, my own way of fly fishing. I've been very clear. I prefer to fish with a dry dropper rig almost all the time. I don't like to nymph if I don't have to. That's just what I enjoy the most. That doesn't mean it's the best way to do it. I try to be very clear about that to all the listeners, uh, just so that you guys know when I'm giving you my opinion versus when I'm trying to share conventional fly fishing wisdom versus quoting folks who know a lot more than I do about these things. So we are going to get some stuff from outside folks, and I'll try to make it clear when I'm giving you just my opinion today. But I did throw out a poll on our YouTube community page. If you're not following us there, please do subscribe to us there. You can get all sorts of fun stuff. You see our masterclass and some other fun videos we have coming up. But I threw a poll out on our YouTube community page on this topic about a week ago, maybe, and we got some really great responses. I asked whether fly fishing guides are worth the money, and after it was more than 1,000 votes, it came out to, I had the numbers right here. 20% said yes, they are absolutely worth it. 9% said no, they're too expensive. 18% said yes, but only the good ones. 41% said not sure, I've never been. And 12% said I'd love to go, but I'm not able to afford it right now. So it was really interesting to me because it shows that overall our community of VFC mirrors not only my own opinions about guides, but also the opinion of the fly fishing community at large. One of the comments we got on that poll that I want to share is, quote, "You get what you put in. They're a wealth of info," meaning guides are a wealth of info. "And if you ask questions, they give you their expertise," end quote. That really, to me, sums up whether a guide's worth it or not. A lot of the guides I know are on the water probably 250 to 300 days a year. They know their fisheries. They know trout. I don't personally know any guides who do anything other than trout, but they know what it takes to succeed. Now, Dallas from Utah asked in his question because he enjoys finding good spots and learning what the fish are eating on his own. And he wonders if he'd feel like he'd be spoon fed almost if he went with a guide. Well, to answer that directly, I want to remind y'all that YouTube comment I just read. And then I'm going to read a quote from Todd Tanner over in a story he wrote in Hatch Magazine. Now, Todd did used to guide, but he primarily writes fly fishing and conservation stories now. He also runs a school of trout. I've known Todd for a while now. I can vouch that he does know his stuff. Anyways, Todd wrote a little story titled "Should You Hire a Fishing Guide?" And in it, he makes a point that I want to share. He writes, quote, "Guides can't read your mind. Please don't treat them like they can." What do I mean? Well, let's be blunt. Far too many guides believe that they already know what their clients want from a day on the water. In other words, most guides assume that their clients want to catch as many large fish as possible. While that assumption will prove accurate with many anglers, it certainly doesn't hold true with everyone. Consequently, the best guides invariably start out their day with a variation of one simple question: what's going to make you happy today? Guides and outfitters work in the service industry. The better ones already know this, and they've long since realized that that while some clients fall into the "as many big fish as possible" camp, others don't. The only way they're ever going to know for sure, and the only way a guide will ever make all his or her clients happy as possible, is to ask. The end of that quote from his story there. As always, I will link that story in the podcast description so you can go read it if you would like to. But that's a very direct response to your question there, Dallas. A guide is going to shorten your learning curve and give you more tools and techniques to succeed. It's like if you're like I was when I was back in college and I had to hire a math tutor. Sure, you could muddle it all out on your own, but isn't it really nice having someone who knows it all to help you out? It really is. Good guides are worth their cost, especially when you consider that a guide probably receives 40 to 50% of the price that you paid for the trip. So if the trip cost you $600, they're getting 250 to 300 maybe from the outfitter for a long day's worth of work. A guide's day starts early and ends late. You've got to get up, you've got to prep flies, prep rods, make sure you've got the lunches and the drinks, ice in the cooler, get the boat to where you're meeting the clients, pick the clients up, get the boat on. You got to do the whole day's worth of guiding, drop the clients off, clean everything, re-rig, tie more flies. It's a lot. And they're long, long days. So if you go into it armed with that topic, armed with that idea of I'm going to ask this guide as many questions as I can, and I'm going to pick their brain as much as I can, I think you're going to get a ton more out of your guided trip than if you just go and say, well, I just want to catch a whole bunch of fish. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if that's what you want to do, go for it. If that's how you want to spend your money, go for it. But I know for a lot of us, a guided trip is really expensive. They're not cheap. I think the last I checked, I think we're looking between 600 and $700 for a lot of my favorite fisheries for a guided day on the water. That's not an insignificant sum of money to a lot of us. So if we're going to make that investment, we want to get the most out of it. Now, for some of us, that might be as many big fish as possible. But if you're listening to this show, if you're looking up content like this, chances are you want to get better. And a guide, if you're going to make that investment, a guide is going to help you get better if you go into it and say, hey, I want to catch some fish today, but what I really want to do is learn. What I really want to do is understand why we're catching these fish. That's something I've said on this show almost since day one, is if you can understand the why behind a lot of these things, it's going to make fly fishing so much easier for you. It's going to make it, you're going to shorten that learning curve exponentially. And that's That's what a lot of beginning instruction lacks in fly fishing is here's the why. We just tell you how to do it. Fish this fly, fish it here, and don't have any drag. You're going to catch fish. We don't explain the why. Well, why is the fish eating that? And guides are great at fishing or at explaining the why. They're great at fishing too, but they're great at explaining the why. Now, the other obvious question here is how do you know if a guide's good, right? Well, I 100% recommend looking at the Google reviews of the outfitter to get an idea of the kind of show they're running. I also recommend asking local Facebook groups for recommendations and try to book directly with those guides. But also, one thing that you need to remember is that an outfitter's entire reputation is based on the guides that they hire. So if they hire bad guides, they're going to have a harder time staying in business. That's not to say bad guides don't exist. They certainly do. I've had a couple. I've been with a couple of guides that were it's just not even worth getting into some of those stories. But if you book with a reputable outfitter, you really shouldn't have to worry about whether or not your guide is quote unquote good because they should be if they're working for a reputable outfitter. You can also ask when you book for a guide or when you book, ask for a guide who will teach you what you want to know versus just putting you on a bunch of fish all day. The outfitters know their guides. They know the ones who are really exceptional teachers because not teaching doesn't come natural to every single guide. Some of the best guides I know would certainly not be the best fishing teachers because it's just not how they are. They're exceptional guides. They can put you on fish. They can row the heck out of that boat and they can tell you put it there and they're really good at explaining, but I don't know that they'd want to sit there and tell you the why all day. So if you ask that up front when you book, I think your chances of getting a guide who's willing to do that are much higher. So that's my 2 cents. I think yes, absolutely guides are worth the money. You're gonna get out of it whatever you put into it, as long as you go into it. And I'm not saying either. I want it very clear. I'm not saying that the only reason a guide's worth it is to go ask them a bunch of questions all day. If your whole thing is I just want to go catch a bunch of fish, spend the money, go catch a bunch of fish. It's fun. But if you're in this to try and learn and try and understand more, and you decide you're going to make that investment with the guide, go into the day armed with the questions that you want to ask, and go into the day being very clear with the guide, saying, this is what I want out of it. I want to learn as much as I can. If I only catch 10 fish today, I'm fine. I'm happy. I want to learn. And I'll tell you, that's music to a guide's ears. When I was guiding, those were my favorite trips to do because it took a lot of the pressure off because there's a lot of pressure on a lot of trips where you've just got to go in and you've got to get people into fish. And if you're not getting them into fish, you're constantly worried that they're not enjoying it, that they're going to be disgruntled or whatever. And again, it goes back to Todd Tanner's quote where I just always assumed they wanted to be into fish. But the folks who actually said to me before, no, teach us the why, help us understand. Those were the trips that stick out in my memory still, because those are the trips that I look back on and think, oh yeah, there wasn't pressure to catch a bunch. I was teaching casting. I was talking about drag. I was talking about bugs. I was talking about how to recognize bugs, how to read water. That was the fun stuff for me as a guide. So really good question, Dallas. I really, really appreciate you sending that one on in. And now, folks, you know what time it is. It's time to grab that Diet Coke, kick back, relax, and get ready for the Q&A portion of this week's show. First question comes to us this week. Tommy from North Carolina writes in and says, just watched Module 4, Section 1 of the Beginning Fly Fishing Masterclass. I took away a lot of really good info. My question deals with leaders. What is the story of braided leaders? Is there a specific medium that you need to use to build one? Can you use regular braided line to build it, or would that be too light to turn over a fly? Thanks and enjoy your caffeine-free diet, Pepsi. Tommy, you are going too far. Caffeine-free diet Pepsi? Come on. Yeah, I mean, just drink water at that point, for crying out loud. Okay, kidding aside, thank you very much for the question, Tommy. I appreciate it. Well, we've actually talked about leaders quite a bit on this show, And the next question on today's show is actually about leaders as well. But what you're talking about here, you're asking about a braided leader. What you're referring to, I think, is a furled leader. Furled or braided leaders are essentially the same thing. There's a little bit of a difference between them, but for our purposes on the show today, they're essentially the same thing. So, a furled leader. These things are essentially a leader that has been braided together from multiple pieces of materials, often either thread, so like the same fly tying thread that we use, or nylon. They end in a tippet ring, and you attach your tippet to that ring to finish building your leader out to your desired length. Most furled leaders come in like a 5 or a 6 foot length, and then you add your tippet onto the end of that tippet ring so you can get it out to the length that you want. This means that the butt section of your leader is essentially permanent, since you won't be cutting into it like you eventually would with a monofilament leader, whether that's nylon or fluorocarbon. Since they are built from multiple strands of material, furled leaders have more mass than a monofilament leader. That mass can actually help turn flies over at shorter distances better than a monofilament leader. The folks who love furled leaders also assert that they are more supple, that they bend or move more easily than monofilament leaders, which can help reduce drag. That supple characteristic can help furled leaders absorb and release energy a bit more effectively than monofilament leaders as well. Furled leaders are really popular with the dry fly crowd. I don't personally know anybody who nymphs with a furled leader. If you do, please let me know. I'd love to hear your experiences with it. I don't personally know anybody who does. I personally know a few folks who do fish furled leaders with dry flies, and they love them, especially on small streams when you've got limited casting room, because since the leader has a little bit more mass, you have to have less fly line out to make the cast, so you end up snagging a little bit less if you know what you're doing on those smaller streams. And it helps reduce the need for false casts as well. Now, that all sounds really great, right? Why aren't we all using furled leaders then if they're that perfect? I mean, what I just described sounds like the ideal leader, doesn't it? Well, yes and no. They're a niche. Nobody's agreed how to pronounce that word, have we? I'd love for somebody probably has, but I want a dadgum YouTube video about how to pronounce this dadgum word. So I'm going to go with niche today. So if that's not how you pronounce it, I'm sorry. But furled leaders, they're a niche product for the most part. A lot of folks, like I said, use them specifically for fishing with dry flies. You'll definitely see a difference in how supple your presentations are with dry flies when you're using a furled leader compared to a monofilament leader. That's where they really shine. I have seen that some companies have started to build furled leaders for streamer and nymph fishing. But again, I don't personally know any anglers who use furled leaders for those purposes, so I can't speak to that. And I mean, I could have combed through reviews on the interwebs, but I couldn't find any legitimately trustworthy, like, here, listen to this and trust this info to pass on to you guys. So I didn't want to waste your time. Now, there is a downside to furled leaders, aside from them being a niche product, is they can get waterlogged and sink. So you have to reapply some sort of paste to keep them floating. When they do get waterlogged and heavy, they lose some of their effectiveness as far as their delicate presentation goes. So at the end of the day, a furled leader requires more work and maintenance than a monofilament leader, which is probably the main reason that they haven't caught on widely in the fly fishing community. And at the end of the day, too, I personally prefer to have a lot fewer knots. Like, I want as few knots in my leader as possible. And when you have to attach tippet to a tippet ring at the end of a furled leader, that presents a potential failure point. The furled leader probably won't break, but your tippet certainly could. Whereas a monofilament leader, to me, it just feels more secure because there are no knots except the knot to your fly. Now, there could be a weak section in that leader. I've had that happen before where I bought leaders that just had weak, not so great sections into them. And I have absolutely no evidence to back up my feelings here. But I'm just trying to explain my point of view. I know a lot of folks build their own leaders and they'll blood knot everything and they don't have any issues with it. and well and good. I tip my hat to you. My personal preference is I want as few knots in that leader as possible because when I hook into a decent fish, I don't want a potential failure point that's my fault. If I lose a fish because my leader snapped because it's a bad leader, that's a lot more palatable to me than if I lose a fish because I tied a bad knot. Because I've lost so many fish because I've tied bad knots. I'm sick and tired of it. So I prefer to just not have as many knots as possible. So that's why I don't think I'll ever personally use furled leaders. I do think they're worth trying out, though, so that you can decide if their benefits outweigh their disadvantages for your own fishing. By no means let me steer you away from giving them a shot. They're certainly worth taking a look at. We appreciate that question, Tommy. Thanks a bunch for sending that in. Jeremiah from Arkansas has got the next question, and he continues our trend on leaders. He writes in and says, what is the difference in all the leaders like nylon, fluoro, and furled? Thank you all for the podcast, and what do you think of Arkansas? And shout out to the Spring River. Hey, Jeremiah, thank you for the question. So we already answered part of your question with the previous question when we talked about furled leaders. But the differences in nylon and fluorocarbon, something that we've covered in depth on this show. I actually went into detail on this topic in episode 50 of the podcast, where you can also learn about catching fish from riffles. So that's a great episode to watch and listen to. I'll link that in the podcast description for you. Now, the main differences. Nylon leaders stretch, they don't sink, and they're often cheaper. Fluorocarbon leaders do stretch, they sink a lot better, and they're more invisible in the water than nylon. Generally, you use nylon for dry flies and fluorocarbon for nymphs and streamers. Now, unfortunately, I've never been to Arkansas, but I would love to get down there. The closest I've ever been was East Texas and northern Louisiana a while ago, driving through on a nice little road trip. I do know there are some nice trout to be had down there, though. So, hopefully your question about furled leaders got answered. And hopefully that brief overview of nylon and fluoro gets you there. One other thing to bring into your awareness here is nylon and fluorocarbon. They're both technically a monofilament leader. Monofilament means just one strand of material. Nylon is a different material than fluorocarbon. So that's, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, mono versus fluoro, and they're talking about the same thing. It really should be nylon versus fluorocarbon. Now, some fluorocarbon leaders and tippet aren't pure fluorocarbon. They're just fluorocarbon coated. But I think most of the stuff that we buy for fly fishing is pure fluorocarbon, so you don't need to worry about that. But if you have any more questions about that topic or episode 50 doesn't completely answer it, then please write back on in. Email us at livereal, that's REEL, life, at, are we at Gmail or Adventures? I think it's adventuresflyco.com. I should know that. Live real life at venturesflyco.com. I'll be more than happy to get back to you. Thanks a bunch for that question. Andrew from Colorado's got another great question for us this week. He writes in and says, now that it's fall, I reverted back to nymphing as my primary technique. We're permitted to fish 3 flies here in the greatest state of Colorado. I've noticed that I end up snagging fish a fair amount, which I really don't like. Do you have any tips on how to avoid this? Thank you. Andrew, the greatest state of Colorado? Really? Obviously, you meant to say Nevada because we all know that that is the GOAT state, right? Okay. As for your question, yeah, it's a common issue. You'll snag more fish if you've got more hooks in the water. That's something you've got to deal with. But it is easy to fix. I'm going to give you an example from a story, and then I'll try to explain more in depth, just so it makes sense. But not last week, a couple weeks ago, Alex and I were out fishing, and Alex had a nymph rig on. I had a dry dropper rig on. I know that's going to shock anybody who's listened to this show before. So I'm fishing my dry dropper rig, and Alex had his nymph rig. And I started out with flies that were actually way too light. I had a dry, and then I think I had a hare's ear and a zebra midge on. And I went too light on the sizes, too small on the sizes. So the flies weren't getting down deep enough. So I had to immediately adjust to slightly heavier flies, and then I actually lengthened my tippet up in between those flies real quick. And that was the first adjustment I had to make. Alex ended up switching from his nymph rig to a dry dropper because his nymph rig was too heavy and he just couldn't quite get the presentation he wanted with that indicator on the water. So he ended up switching to a dry dropper rig, which is one dropper. And and we both caught a ton of fish. Actually, we got into a little bit of a trout rodeo. Alex, we were just about to head back to the truck because it was getting late and I had like a 6 hour drive to get home. And Alex is like, all right, well, we're done. And we've been jokingly keeping track how many fish we caught all day. And we were tied at 10-10 at when we were about ready to leave. And then Alex is like, hold on. He runs down, he catches one more. He's like, 11-10, time to go. And I'm like, okay, whatever. So I start heading back to the truck, but I didn't know that Alex was still down on the river. He was just kind of walking. And I was a quarter of the way back to the truck. It was maybe half mile away. So I was a decent ways away from the river when all of a sudden I just hear it was pretty quiet and I just hear, dude. And when you hear that noise out on the river, especially from Alex, you drop everything and run. So I just threw my rod and my bag down and I just start hauling it. And I'm running waders and wading boots, which, is great, right? So I'm hauling it down. There's snow everywhere. There's rocks. I'm trying not to slip and die. I get down there and I see Alex in a friggin' trout rodeo in the river. He's flopping everywhere. He can't almost stand upright. His rod's bent almost in half. And I just see this massive splashing. And then the fish turns and shoots downstream on him. So I'm like, oh crap. So I'm trying to catch up to Alex and let him know that I'm there without scaring him because I don't want him to like jump and lose the fish. He's trying to net it on his own because he didn't think I was coming back. Because between his yelling and me getting there was probably a minute, maybe 2 minutes. So he didn't think I was coming back. He thought I was still at the truck. So I finally get down there. I splash into the stream and I'm like, dude. And he looks up and he throws me the net and he's holding onto the fly rod with both hands. And he's like grinning from ear to ear. He's like, it's a huge one. And I'm like, what is it? And he's like, I don't know. And I'm like, oh, great. And this thing took him like 250 yards downstream from where he hooked it. It's a really small stream with a really fast current. And if it's almost all pocket water, and if fish get out of the pocket, they just shoot downstream. So you end up chasing the bigger fish downstream. It's not because Alex was tiring it out or not playing it correctly. It's just the nature of this little river that we were on. Well, I finally get underneath the fish and Alex is like trying to lift its head up and I dive in with the net real quick and I get it, I scoop it up, and it was a 22-inch tiger trout. Uh, yeah, not what we expected because the only fish we've ever caught out of that stream before were rainbows, browns, and cutthroat. We'd never caught a tiger trout out of there before. So that was really interesting to see, especially one that stinking big. And so we got a picture with it, put it back, it swam off. And then we're walking back to the truck, and Alex looks at me. Doesn't say thanks, just says 12-10. And that's how you know you got a good fishing buddy. But I tell that story to illustrate the need when you're fishing with multiple flies for constant adjustment. Because throughout the day, Alex and I were constantly adjusting until we found the strike zone where the fish were. We were adjusting our rigs until we got those nymphs down to where they needed to be. Now, the trick here, if you fish a 3-fly rig, like I said, is constant adjustment, knowing when to use heavy versus light flies, adding or removing split shot, and adjusting your indicator. If you're snagging up a lot, start by moving the indicator so you're not caught up in the bottom as often or you're not snagging up on fish as often. If that doesn't work, switch out one of your heavier flies for a lighter fly. If that still doesn't work, just start fishing dries. That's what you should have been doing in the first place, right? No, I kid. A dry dropper with 2 nymphs might even be better in that situation if you're snagging up a lot. And surprisingly, fish will come up and eat that dry fly. It was on that same trip with Alex. It was like, I think 35 degrees. There was a little mayfly hatch that tried to come off. It wasn't very big, but I had 3 or 4 fish eat my dry fly. So they'll still come up and hit it sometimes. So it's worth having it on there. Remember though, snagging up on the bottom every once in a while means that you're right in the strike zone, which is where you want to be. If you're snagging the fish, It likely means that maybe you're a little late on the hook set, and that's the issue with three flies is you usually need to fish a bigger indicator and it's a heavier rig, so the lighter takes, especially in winter, you don't necessarily always feel. That's why my go-to if I'm going to fish three flies in the winter, I do a heavier fly up top and two lighter flies underneath. Because usually the water is a little bit lower, you can get away with that kind of a lighter setup. And that way, if they take the smaller fly, I can see it. And I try and fish a smaller indicator too, so that I can see the takes. Hopefully, it's a bit more sensitive. I would also highly recommend, Andrew, that you go watch our nymphing episode that Alex and I did. We talk a lot more about this concept in that episode, and you can find a link to that in the podcast description. And as always, if you need more details or information, please just reach out and let us know. George from California has got the next question, writes in and says, does anyone out there demagnetize their hooks? I had to pick up a cheap demagnetizer to prevent my tools from sticking to the hooks as I try to sort them out when choosing a hook. George, it's an interesting question. I've actually never had that problem before, personally. But I did look around on some forums, did some light Googling, and it looks like other folks have that issue as well, so it's not just a you thing. It looks like you'd want to demagnetize the tool, not the hooks themselves. If you try to demagnetize each hook, that would take forever. So if anybody else is having this problem too, demagnetize your tools. Pick up a demagnetizer. They look like they're pretty cheap, and use it on your tools instead of the hooks. And I actually really like questions like this, George, because that's a problem I've never run into before and never really even thought of that being a potential issue before. So if anyone has questions like these, please send them in. I love these because this helps me connect more with y'all, helps me understand more what I can do to create better content that's more informative and more helpful for you at the end of the day. Because that's what I'm here for. I mean, I'm going to give you advice on diet soda and wings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about fly fishing, but I'm here to help you be a better fly fisher at the end of the day. That's the whole goal. And speaking of being better at fly fishing, you're going to want to stick around for episode 62 next week because Alex and I did an extravagant little episode on tying flies. I almost said flying ties. I'm tired. It's been a long day. We got a good fly tying episode next week coming up. You're not going to want to miss it. We're going to go through some steps that every beginner should know with tying flies. You definitely want to make sure you tune in for episode 62. And as always, if you've got a question that you would like answered on this show, please send it in. There's always a link in the podcast description. And make sure you're rating and subscribing to this show wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up in the algorithm, helps us become a dominant force in the industry, helps spread the word of VFC to everybody and anybody who needs it. And with that, folks, I really appreciate y'all sticking around to the end of this episode. Get out on the water, and until next week, tie lines, everybody.